All right, this is lab number 11, and today, as you can see there, the topic is reverb. So that is what we are going to talk about today, and we might as well just get it going here. We're going to talk about a little reverb processing. Now, this is kind of a cool thing, guys, because what we're going to do here today is examine a bunch of different types of reverbs, and we're going to talk about their origins and things like that. You know, where did they actually come from? And honestly, the reason I bring that up is I started doing this after I met up with a bunch of fairly young students, and we got on the topic of processing and reverbs and stuff. And it's like we would talk about flanging, and they would go, "Why do they call it a flanger?" And then we'd talk about a plate, and they'd go, "Why do they call this thing a plate?" You know, like they had really no idea that these things came from actual hardware and buildings and techniques and stuff. They just thought they were kind of cool, unique names. So I thought, well, maybe we should just do a little background here on and show people that what these things are actually trying to emulate, and then we'll talk about why we use them and where to use them, etc. So let's talk about that first, and we'll do it from a couple of different contexts here of talking about when. I don't really want to lay down any rules here. That is not the goal today here, but we'll talk about when to use reverb for live sound, when to use it for recording, when to use it for Foley work, things like that. And the goal of this, just to kind of set some expectation and some ground rules here. I'm not here to discuss which reverb is better. Is the AMS reverb as good as the AMS plugin? Is anything better than the 224? Was the 480L actually better? That discussion is off the table today. Okay, we're here just to talk about reverb in a very, very generalized sense. We're going to talk about some of the parameters, like key parameters that'll help you get to the sounds that you want to get to, etc. So we're not here to compare the subjectivity of all of these reverbs. Matter of fact, we're going to use one reverb today to demonstrate all of this. Okay, so again, just to set some expectation here. So when should I use reverb effects? Well, as the sign says there, you would actually probably be shocked how much reverb is used on every recording. And it usually falls into one of two categories. Either they've recorded the reverb in the room that they're recording, or they've added a digital emulation to it and combined reverbs, et cetera, to do it. But, lo and behold, it's there. On all recordings, there is some spatial element to every recording, all right? So, the deal is in recording, we do a lot more distant miking than we do close miking, but on close miking, sometimes we'll use reverb on those close mics too. I call it naturalizing them, where you're trying to make them feel a little more natural and not, like a DI version of the snare drum, so to speak, And why should I use them? This is always a good topic here to talk about, especially from the context of live sound, right? Because I've had people ask me this before, and it's such a nuanced conversation, but I've had people ask it for sure. It's like, well, I'm already in a big reverberant space. Why would I add reverb to anything? And it's a great question, and like I say, it's a nuanced discussion, and you have to answer it with, well, what am I using the reverb for? Right? What am I going to use it for? Am I using it? Am I trying to create a space for that particular microphone or that instrument? Am I trying to replicate what was done in the recording in terms of a space? Or am I actually just trying to create a sound per se, a snare sound, a vocal sound, and add that and have it complement my mix? Try to build something complementary to my mix. And like I say, it's a nuanced argument. Depending on your application, right? So I give you probably the best example of it I can think of off the top of my head. If we, when we record an orchestra, say, all right, the room is part of the sound of the orchestra. There's just no escaping it because it's almost always zone mic'd plus distant mic'd and added together. We're not really close miking things in an orchestra. The room component of it is a huge part of the sound. So if I was in live sound and I was going to do a close mic'd orchestra, well, in that situation, I'm probably going to want to use a room sound, a hall or something to make that feel more like a natural sounding orchestra, right? But you know, if it's pop rock, if I'm mixing AC/DC, am I going to put a big hall on the vocal? I mean, it's not, it doesn't really complement that style of music, right? So, that's part of the agenda here today is to discuss all these different types of reverbs and possibly when you would use them for any given application, right? Am I trying to, because let's face it, I mean, in recording, right? Especially pop and rock recording, we're not using reverbs to emulate a space per se, right? There's nothing, I always kind of laugh when I hear, well, I'm looking for this really natural reverb sound to use in my mix for multi-tracking or something like that. It's like, well, there's nothing natural about that whatsoever to begin with. All bets are off. Just use whatever you want to use until you find something you like. I mean, it's such a subjective thing. That's kind of why I say, don't get into this idea of it's got to be the most natural sounding reverb. It's got to be. All bets are off for pop and rock recording. Use whatever you want. It's totally to taste there, right? But a lot of times those spaces are I see being used are usually pretty small spaces. They're pretty small, tight spaces until we get space in the music where we might want to create something that's a little bigger and a little broader. But that's all to taste, all right? But in live sound, a lot of times, I mean, I've had it come up, when I do mixing demonstrations or clinics, people are shocked. I mean, literally shocked how much reverb I'm actually using in a live setting, even if we're playing really, really big places, And it's usually a lot of tight reverbs, a lot of tight to medium reverbs, with the odd long one, depending on if the music will allow for it, right? But like I say, most people are shocked how much is being used. All right, so next piece of that would be how much, right? How much reverb do I use? And again, this is a subjective thing, totally. And this is a very generalized rule. It's served me pretty well over the years, and it'll get you to a good spot. Especially if you're listening to individual instruments and you're blending reverb to it, turn it up until you can hear it, and then just turn it down just a little bit, and then check it within your mix, right? I mean, that's a great starting point to keep you from getting kind of over reverbed in your mix, so to speak, and have everything drowning, etc. Now, today we're just going to talk about the reverbs themselves. I'm going to try to put together a little series of labs here where we talk about delays, we talk about harmonics, all kinds of stuff, and then as a kind of a finisher, come back and talk about how to combine all these things into making given sounds or given textures for a given input. All right, does that sound good to everybody? You okay with kind of the approach here? This is kind of a fun thing to check out, especially in digital today. All right, so let's talk about these reverb types. Let's just take a look at all of these different things. And I did this with the kids to just kind of explain to them when they call something a hall, it's because they're trying to emulate the acoustics and the characteristics of an actual hall, right? A big place. So that's why it's called a hall. Likewise, if we get down into a room is smaller than a hall. It's going to have different first reflection characteristics. It's going to have a different coloration to it. It's going to have a different overall size and shape. And it's going to sound differently as a room. A room does not, is a hall a room? Yes, it is. It's a very, very big room with lots of first and second reflection. Chambers is an interesting one because there are actual chambers, i.e. where chamber music came from. And usually these are small, not necessarily acoustically perfect rooms by any stretch of the imagination, but they're usually small rooms that would be adjoining to a big concert hall where the chamber orchestra would play, or smaller sections would play. But we also have chambers that we can create, right? Any of you guys with recording background would probably recognize doing this. I can remember specifically recording a couple records up at Power Station, New England, where they had, where we kind of, we kind of discovered this really cool chamber there. And it was downstairs underneath the control room where they had storage built down there. And it was just a concrete square down there. I mean, it didn't look much different to the picture that you see here. And it was echo and reverb city down there. It was the most dense reverb you could ever imagine down there. So we ran a speaker down there, put a microphone down there, ran the drums through the speaker, recorded the microphone, and that was our chamber for the records, just like they do at Capitol, places like that. It's the same process there where you're actually recording the acoustics of that room. And depending on where you put the speaker, where you put the microphone, you get all kinds of variation on what you're doing there. But it's a fantastic way to do it. Very cool sounding. Plates, they're actually, this was the funny one with the kids. It's like, yes, this is actually a big hunk of metal that we're exciting to make it sound like reverb. All right, so this actually existed. Yes, there was this big thing called a plate. So, you know, the guys that are in the room that have done this a little bit before, you guys know what a plate is, et cetera. Well, the digital versions of it are just emulating that, as you'll hear today. And then, of course, spring reverbs. You would, you know, I'm old enough and got enough gray hair to remember when spring reverbs was the only thing we had at front of house, you know, in the late 70s, early 80s for sure. So, you know, they were taken out of guitars and, you know, remanipulated, or guitar amps and remanipulated, or organs and remanipulated. But this was a very, at the time, a very effective reverb for sure. But it's definitely got its own very distinct sound, which we'll talk about today. And then, of course, there's ambience, right? We talked about this a little bit in our audience miking and ambient miking discussion last lab, but this is usually very tight. You know, you can see even with this microphone kind of pointed at the floor here, or, you know, standing on the floor here, it's not going to have a lot of reflective property in it. It's going to be pretty dense sounding. And as you can see here, they were probably using this to record a drum kit or et cetera. It's a great adder to drum sounds, et cetera, to give them a little more life and make them feel really cool. Oops. And then finally, nonlinear effects. You know, these are reverbs that honestly couldn't exist in an actual acoustic space. We're actually using the digital domain to make something that could not be in physical life. All kinds of really cool possibilities here. So, you know, these things obviously are not a building. These are digital emulation. Okay. Anybody got any questions up to that point? I'm kind of watching the chat here a little bit at my leisure here. All right, so let's talk about some common reverb terms and just some, you know, some of the parameters that we're generally going to mess with, and we're going to mess with these today to kind of demonstrate these different sounds. So these are the most common terms, probably: reflections, diffusion, absorption, and damping, right? And what do those look like, guys? Those are all acoustic terms, right? A reflection is an echo in the room, and there can be one or more of them, of course. Diffusion is the dispersion of that echo, right? Where it sounds a little more chattery, a little more noisy, if you will. It doesn't sound like an actual echo. It's very diffuse sounding. And then absorption and damping can affect the coloration of the reverb. It'll affect the sound quality of it, right? No different than if we took and put mattresses up around a room, that would be a completely damped room to a certain frequency, and, you know, it would sound pretty dead, right? Well, we can usually adjust absorption and damping characteristics of a reverb as well. And then the most common parameters we're going to mess with are pre-delay, first reflection level. On all of these digital reverbs, nearly all of them anyway, you can adjust the first reflection. And I'll try to demonstrate to you today how important that one parameter is to the sound that you're going to try to get, okay? We can always adjust the room size, and probably the most common thing that we're going to adjust, you know, in these reverbs is decay time, right? So those four things, you work on adjusting and getting those four things dialed in. Those will be the most impactful to any reverb that you choose, digital or otherwise there. Or I should say plug-in or hardware, either way. So let's see, Robert, I got a question from Robert Capizano here. I'll just go ahead and address this one while we got it here. Robert, do you use the reverb time based on tempo? Possibly. I would say normally, I don't necessarily do it mathematically where it's down to a tempo where I'll do it, but I will usually try to get reverb tails to fit in. Now, that's not necessarily to say that I make reverb tails go from the beginning of the bar to the end of the bar. I mean, for drums, they may not even last an eighth note, you know, so they may be very, very tight. But a lot of times, you know, if I've got the time to do that, yeah, I'll squeak them in. Certainly if I'm mixing on record, I'll try to do that and make it, you know, feel, I don't want to say feel mechanical, but once you get the time locked in, then you can relax it a little bit and let it go past the note or earlier than the note, whatever you want to do to get it to have a little more feel to it. So yeah, there's some goodness to actually addressing it to tempo. All right, let's carry on here. Oh yeah, and room shape and color. Those are two other ones that you might want to mess with in your parameters, okay? All right, so before we get started here, if you want to bring up anything for us to discuss here, we can certainly do that. And then we're going to get on to some listening here. Hopefully I've got this sorted out where you can hear this in stereo. I kind of broadcast it back to myself this morning and got it to be in stereo. So hoping you guys can too. All right. Any questions for anybody? All right. Well, let's, I don't think we need that anymore. Let's get this.
Here you go. You want a teaching aid?
What do you got? Yes, I know that device.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys do. This thing sounds amazing. Right on. Carry on, guys.
It's so funny, man. It's so funny how time changes our perception of this. I have a friend here in town who was out shopping somewhere or something and picked up one of these old AKG reverbs. And I used to have one here at the studio and used it forever. I mean, I used it on so many things. But at some point, you know, I started to realize, you know what, this thing is noisy. I mean, it is really noisy. And I think it was like a 12-bit reverb, something like that. And I sold it. I just kind of went, okay, it's time to move on. I'll get something else in here and start using it. And of course, he bought it at some garage sale or something for like, you know, $50 or whatever. And it was
this thing is really clean. This thing is really clean. It's incredible sounding. And yeah, it is like 16 beat or something like that, but it doesn't sound anything like anything Yamaha that we all remember.
Yeah.
So it's pretty special sounding.
Yeah, cool.
Right on.
All right, so I'm going to identify what we're going to do here today. This is going to be a little bit of a wacky test here for you. But again, we can kind of do this in digital. And I want you to just, for the sake of the argument, try to contemplate trying to do what we're going to do today in analog, you know, with actual devices. It would be almost impossible to do. So I'm going to give you the layout of what we're going to do here today. Let me make sure I'm on the right type here. Okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take and we're going to excite all of these reverbs at the same time, and then we're going to listen to them one at a time. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to listen to a hall compared to a room, compared to a chamber, compared to a plate, compared to a spring, compared to an ambience, compared to a nonlinear. All the same times, and we're just using the same reverb to do this, but you'll get the sense of this once we do it. And we're just going to listen to them kind of back to back to listen to the different characteristics of each one of these devices, okay? And then we're going to start comparing them in terms of their ability once you reduce and expand time on them. So we'll go and listen to a hall out at a little over 4 seconds, all the way down, and chunk it down all the way down to under half a millisecond, and listen to what it does to it as we scale it down. And as we do that, what I'm hoping you'll start to see is that, you know, there are times when, you know, taking something big and scaling it down to work on a drum, there are certain things that work a little better than others, you know, because they don't have certain characteristics and properties, okay? All right, so to kind of give you some sense of what we're going to do, because we're not going to do this musically today. I just thought, okay, I'm not going to pick one instrument to do this. We're just going to pick a source to do this that will reveal all of this about these units. So let me just make sure I've got this where you can hear it. So one of the sources we're going to use is a thumper. It's basically a polarity thumper, but it's a good full range thump. So it's going to sound like this. You guys hear that okay? Should be a little clicky thumpy. You guys hear that okay? Yeah, okay.
Yes, sir.
And then we're also going to have a chirp, which is a full range chirp. Why aren't you good? There we go. Okay, so those are the sources, and I've done this in the past, kind of checking out different types of reverbs and stuff. So I've created a combination of those two things, and this is what it sounds like. Okay? So this is going to give you a really good sense of low frequency content in the room and the reflective qualities in the room. Okay, I'll give you, so we'll start out, we're just going to listen to a hall here. Let me do this so you can see it. So we're just going to start out in a medium natural hall. This is about 3.1 seconds, and I'm going to let you listen to just the reverb return to start off with. Okay, so I'll take that out. We've all mixed in this room. We know what it sounds like. All right, so just try to get your hair, I'm just going to let this run for a second and get your ears kind of wrapped around this. Whatever you're listening on, get it kind of sorted out where you can hear this pretty well. And just take note of the low frequency content and the echo structure of this particular space, okay? Now keep in mind, I have no dry signal in that right now. We're just listening to the reverb return. If I add in the dry signal here, and then I'll add in the parallel return. Now I'm going to mute the dry signal. Oops, sorry. Okay, so for this kind of comparison, at least I'm just going to speak for me here. When I'm doing this, it helps me just to hear the return. I don't necessarily need to hear the dry to wet blend here. I just want to listen to the characteristics of the reverb. So we're only going to be listening to the reverb returns here, okay? So the first one we're going to listen to is a hall, and that's this one. I'm going to go to a room. Should be able to notice how much smaller the space is and how much more direct that first reflection is. I'll go back just for comparison. Okay, here we come to a chamber now. Obviously, way different low frequency response in a chamber, much smaller room, very short first reflection. And let's listen to a plate. Now, if you can see the parameters up there, each one of these have essentially the same pre-delay and first reflection parameters, right? This has got about 24 milliseconds of pre-delay. You can start to see why plates are so appetizing to use on drums and percussion, certainly on vocals, right? They're very, very smooth, kind of dense, reverby sound. Let's listen to a spring. See Dave Morgan shaking his head. We've been there, Dave, haven't we?
Should we tell him about having to fly the reverb?
Yes. I need a rigger to fly my plate, please. Yes. I remember those days. I never got to do it, but if I had it, I would have done it. All right, here's ambience.
We flew springs, Robert. We flew the springs.
My man. All right, here's ambience. Whoops, sorry. I'm sorry, operator error. Here's ambience. And again, you kind of hear why this would be really appetizing on drums, etc., especially for kind of modern sounding drums, right? Very dense, not a lot of real reflective properties to deal with here, right? Remember, these are all the same reverb times, etc. We're just comparing the different algorithms for each. All right, here is nonlinear. So obviously you can hear that there's a reverse in this. They've actually got this kind of reversing here. So this obviously wouldn't be possible in an actual space. Okay? So you kind of get the idea here. We're going to be on this for a little bit, so get used to this sound here. All right? Is everybody kind of picking up on the differences of all of these? Yeah? You can hear it on your in your listening environment there? All right, so I'm going to go back to back here. Maybe I'll do this. Stand by. I'll get a camera up here where you can kind of see me change it. If you watch, let's see, I don't know how I can identify it here. Let's do this, see if we can do it here. Stand by for me. This way you can see it. Okay, so I'll try to outline them here just so you can kind of see what's on. Can you guys see the mute button okay there? Oh, this might be a little tough to read here. So hall, room, chamber, plate, spring, ambience, nonlinear. Okay, so we're just going to go one-on-one here. And again, try to imagine doing this in analog with real gear, right? I mean, this would almost be impossible to do. It's one of the beauties of digital that you can do these kind of studies, all right? All right, here we go. I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm just going to go down the line here, one after another, all right? Just listen to them back to back. I'll make the run about 2 or 3 times here. Just contemplate where you might want to use these particular sounds. Nope, sorry guys. I'm just going to get an annotation up here where you guys can see. If you watch right here what I've got outlined in green, that'll also tell you what I'm on. You can see that maybe a little better. Okay. So if I, for instance, if I go back here, it'll tell you I'm on halls, rooms, chambers, plates, springs, ambience, and nonlinear. Okay. So we'll go through one more time, and then I'm going to add the dry signal to it just to give you an idea, and then we'll start talking about parameters, etc. Excuse me. Okay, let's add in the dry signal now, just to get a sense of what that feels like as well. There's our dry. Going to go through a little quicker this time now. Okay. Interesting, right? Anybody fascinated by that? I know for me, when I started doing this, just to try to get a better sense of what I was going to use reverbs on and in what capacity, this was totally enlightening to me. All of a sudden, like my choice of things to use it on became very organized, for lack of a better term. So let's take a look at some parameters now. I'm going to go back to this hall. And I just want to enlighten you to, if you don't know it already, how important a couple of these parameters are to the sound that you're trying to get. All right, so we'll start with the first reflection level. I think this is probably the most overlooked one that I see guys dealing with. They get kind of lost in this one sometimes. So we're going to talk about first reflection in a hall here, because it's probably the best example of it. It's got the most prominent, some of the most prominent first reflection in it. All right, so let's open up hall again. And I'm going to go up here and turn the first reflection off, and you'll get a sense of what it actually does to the sound. So I'll stop talking for a minute, watch my, let's see if I can do it here. Yeah, so if you watch my cursor there, it'll turn on the first reflection. Now remember, there's no dry signal in this. Here's dry. Just reverb, and we're going to turn off first reflection. Hear how much farther it goes away from you there, right? There's no first reflection added to it there. And in most reverbs, you can adjust the level of that first reflection in your reverb. It becomes a very, very important component of it. And it should also enlighten you to the idea that you can do this. A lot of recording guys, I know a handful of recording guys that I've run into in my life, they may, if they're doing pop rock records, they might not even use reverb. They might just use delay to do it, creating first reflections, first and second reflections to kind of simulate reverb. So what this should enlighten you to is that you could add delay to this and have more control over your first reflection. Wouldn't be uncommon. I've certainly seen this on rock records lately, where somebody will take a delay to create the first reflection and distort the crap out of it, and then feed it into the reverb. And you get this really broad, grainy, dense aspect to the reverb. So they're just taking control of the first reflection there. Obviously, the first reflection there is not dealt with in coloration. It's a duplicate of the input there. The room is not messing with it much. Get the idea there? So same thing applies to the room as well. Oops, I'm sorry. Same for the chamber. Same for the plate. Now, we're kind of cheating a little bit here on the plate because, the actual plate itself, like if you were using an actual plate, it wouldn't have necessarily that first reflection in it. You would have to put it in there. Like, I used to see, who used to do this? Well, Keith Olsen was the first guy I ran into that would do this, where he would use a PCM 41 or 42 in front of his plate. So signal would go into the PCM and then PCM into the plate so he could create some first reflection in that plate. You go back and listen to all those Keith Olsen records, like his plate that he had at Goodnight LA is all over those records with that kind of setting on it. So we're in digital here, so they're giving you the opportunity to do that. And like I said, we're doing kind of a match processor here with algorithms creating each one of these, right? So this is a plate with first reflection in it. And now out. All right, let's look at spring. Okay, let's look at ambience. And let's let's look at non-linear. So you can see the reverse aspect of it is the first reflection. Okay, so that first reflection is actually a really, really big component of your reverb sound. And as you can see, even on this processor, they give you the ability to do some coloration on it as well. But just me personally, I love turning that first reflection off and using my own delay to create the first reflection so that I can do really whatever I want to do with it. You know, I can create regeneration on that delay, lots of feedback on it, and then send it to the reverb, especially on vocals. I think I demonstrated this, where did I demonstrate this recently? It might have been at Mix U on the Patti LaBelle stuff, where I had delay on her voice that was not bussed anywhere. It was just bussed to the reverb, and I was using it to actually create the space on her voice, but the delay never gets in the way of the voice at that point. You know, it's just first reflection, and it worked just so good, so good. All right, so let's talk about another parameter here that is very important to your to your reverbs. And whoever asked about, do I do things to tempo with my reverbs? If I do anything to tempo sometimes, it will usually be pre-delay. I will usually have my pre-delay, starting on a beat of the song, all the way down to a 30-second note sometimes if I'm going to keep it really tight. But I will usually know that time and enter it in my pre-delay to keep that math right. So let's listen to pre-delay being changed with the hall. Here we go. Okay, so you kind of get the sense that pre-delay is just kind of what the word is implying there, right? We're going to put a space of time before the reverb actually starts. Right? That's really all that is about, pre-delay. It's amount of delay before we actually hear the reverb begin to engage, right? So let's actually, this is probably better with the source in. So let's listen to it with the dry signal. And I'm going to turn this back down a little bit, and you'll get a sense of how these two interact here. So the first reflection is on. And now I'm going to push up the pre-delay. So you can see there that pre-delay is actually delaying the first reflection as well, right? So if you want something that's really rhythmic there, I mean, you can really create some rhythm if you want to do it by adjusting that pre-delay, right? So keep in mind, there are two different types of delay, and, you know, you kind of don't want to get stuck with both, you know, or stuck misinterpreting one for the other. There is first reflection and there is pre-delay, right? Pre-delay is going to affect both the first reflection and the reverb. First reflection is not. It's just going to be that first reflection time, right? Yeah, handball court. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. There, it sounds like. Kind of sounds like we're playing handball, doesn't it? All right, is that starting to make sense to you guys there? Your silence will be your confirmation. Hopefully everybody's still getting that. Everybody's still hearing it. All right, so the next thing that I thought we would do, which is kind of revealing, is I thought we would take each one of these, hall, room, chamber, plate, right on down the line, and break them down in starting from a large hall all the way down to a small hall, meaning, and we're just adjusting reverb time here. Because this is, for my money, this is part of the secret to using a lot of reverb on your mixes and not having them drowned, you know, and to create you know, sounds that are supportive of what you're trying to do mixing. All right, so let me get to the next preset here. So what we're going to listen to here is we're going to start without the source sound on again, and we're going to listen to halls starting at 4.1 seconds all the way down to about half a millisecond, right? And see, and I want you to be thinking as you're listening to this, where you might fit this in or what instruments you might use this on, all right? What instruments, what voices, etc., and how it could actually impact your mixes, okay? So here we go. This is Hall at 4.1. Let me go fast. Okay, we're going to go through again and we're going to add the source sound to it. All right, so you can see even something as dry and uninteresting as this chirp, I call it chirp and burp. That's what I got it labeled as, chirp and burp. You know, as kind of dry and uninteresting as this is, even adding just a little bit of short Hall to it makes it feel like something, right? Hold down here, maybe. Now it feels like I could use it in somewhere, you know, I mean, and this kind of starts to bring up the discussion of, you know, why would we use reverb on something that is already in a big reverberant space, right? And it has to do with, you know, during the recording process, those reverbs or those tight sounds, whether they're recorded in the studio or they're added digitally, are there to create a sound, right? They're there to create a snare sound. I mean, who thinks snare drums sound natural? They haven't sounded natural for 30 years, right? I mean, they are filled with ambience. Sometimes on rock records, I'll use Tom Petty as the example. The only thing you hear is the ambience on the snare drum. There is no dry snare drum in there for all intents and purposes because it's part of the sound. So that's kind of the nuanced argument of, you know, if I'm building a mix, even if I'm going to present it live, there are production techniques within that mix that I use to get specific sounds, right? And I want to present them. And I always come back to this. Look, if you were listening to that great sounding Sting record coming out of your PA system, are you telling me that it would sound better if you took off all the studio reverb effects on it, if you just went to the close mics there? I would tell you that it would not. It would not sound better. It would sound different, that's for sure, but it's not going to have that kind of balanced, polished, whatever adjective you want to use for that mix, because those guys have very, very effectively used the space surrounding those instruments. All right, Scott Taylor's got his hand up. We're going to stop there for a question. Go, Scott. I'm going to grab a drink while you're asking.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Did you do a gated reverb? Because, I mean, whenever I think of like that short reverb that you did, that last one, to me, that kind of sounds like a gated reverb, but maybe you just haven't gotten to it yet.
I haven't done a gated reverb, and I don't plan on doing one today. And if this should enlighten you to anything, that a lot of times you can simulate a gated reverb just by shortening the time, right?
Right, that's kind of what I figured.
But certainly a production trick, and I won't reveal who I know this about, but certainly a big artist from the 80s and famous drummer from the 80s, one of their tricks to their snare sound was to use he recorded with a piccolo snare for one, but the other was to take an AMS ambient setting and run it out really long, really, really long, and then gate it, where you only caught the first, 700 milliseconds of that reverb sound, So it was truly a gated reverb sound, but it was one where they were running it out really long and then chopping it off and only using the first 600, 700 milliseconds of it. So, and it was a pretty cool sound. I mean, you go back and listen to those records today and go, ooh, that snare is cool, man.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right, so let's kind of do this little test for the halls and all the different reverbs, and then we'll be coming up on the hour here, and we'll just kind of discuss this and chop it up and talk about it, all right? So I'm going to leave the source sound in, and we're going to go big to small, halls through nonlinear. Okay, so I'll try not to talk too much and just watch your screen there. You can see what's up, whether it's halls or whatever in the little green box there. Okay, here we go. These are rooms now. Kind of like that. All right, here's the next one. This will be chambers. Here's plates. Interesting. All right, and here we go with springs. It's the Mike Campbell guitar sound. Listen to how odd the bottom end sounds like. That's awesome. Oops. All right, here we go with ambience. I think you're going to dig this. I really like those. Those are very natural sounding. I mean, if that's your thing. All right, let's go nonlinear. Now, you might be saying to yourself, matter of fact, I'm sure you're saying to yourself, who would use that anywhere? But you'd be surprised where you can use that. I may not use it quite that reversed sounding, but I know on the Def Leppard records and on the tour, for sure, we were using a lot of really gritty, grindy, non-linear sounds on the guitars. Like that seemed to work really well on the guitars to try to get them to kind of sit and jump at the same time. It was really cool. Worked really good. Thoughts? Anyone? Anyone? Has this changed your thinking about reverbs at all, or maybe opened up your mind about little bits about it? I mean, I'll just throw it out there. I mean, I think for me, more often than not, especially for rock and pop drums, if there's any kind of ambient quality to it, I actually use a combination of two things. I'll use a combination of a room and a combination of a plate. Or I should say a combination of those two things. Usually I'll use a room and a plate. So, you know, it would end up being something about like this. Let me go here. So it would probably be room about this size. Maybe a little smaller. kind of dependent on song, it would be either one of these. I'll leave it there for now. And sorry guys, I'll do it right here in a second. 1 second. Sorry, give me 1 second. It's operator error. Hang in there with me, I'm a little off script here. So it would be probably this and this. And again, this is kind of a simulation, but this is kind of... So if I had kind of a de facto combination of room and plate, that is probably it for drums. And I'm sending kick, snare, and toms to this generally. So I might lean the plate a little more toward the snare drum, but usually I've got room on the kick, toms, and snare. So this would be on the kick, toms, and snare. And then I would add the plate in on the snare. Something like that. Know what I'm saying? Who had their hand up there? Was that Martin? Martin, did you have your hand up there?
It was, yes, I do. My question is this, Robert. Are there times when you will use a verb or a combination of two verbs like you just demonstrated in various degrees across an entire mix in order to put that mix in a very specific space?
I don't know that I would certainly, the first part of that answer has to be, it depends on the style of music for sure. I mean, I don't think in pop, rock, jazz, actually I'll back jazz off of that for a second. I'll say in pop rock, I would probably never do that. I would probably never do that. I would say there's a chance I might do that in jazz, right? Although jazz is a perfect example of, I will probably do stuff that is really, like if I'm close mic'd in jazz, even if it's front bass drum, overhead on the drum kit, stand-up bass, piano mics, even if I've got that going on, I might add some very short spaces to any or all of those to get them to fit into some sort of room and then let it just happen in the actual space that we're in. I would say, especially if I'm in a small jazz room like a 400, 500 seater, if I want to open that up and have it, kind of recreate that, a bigger space there, I might do that there, but I would be very judicious with that. I wouldn't be, you don't want to be real showy with that at all. You want to really ease that in on people. If anybody recognizes you doing it, it's way too loud and you're using too much of it there, especially for jazz, right? You want to be very delicate there. And I would say the same thing for orchestra. I can kind of go back, I'll go back to a time about 1979 where we were doing Philharmonic work outdoors, which is brutal to begin with. But, we always wanted to add a reverberant quality to that to try to make it feel more like it was in a shell or something to give it some reverberant character, because everything was close mic'd in that situation. There was no way you were going to do open air orchestra distant mic'd and have it be anything. You would have as much wind noise as you had anything in the mix. So in that situation, I might add a room emulation to it to try to create a band shell kind of feel to it. Sure. But probably not in pop rock. Those are all individually ambience, if that's an adjective, things, right? Does that make sense to you?
Sure does. Thank you.
Awesome. So, combinations of things, and hopefully I can kind of close this in the lab that we do at the very end of all of this, where we kind of talk about combining reverbs and delays and harmonic work to create these given spaces and sounds in your mix to make them work and sound really cool. You know, when I've done mix clinics in the past, I think Pooch will attest to this. I think he's heard me do this. You know, where people are kind of stunned at how much reverb is actually happening on that mix and don't realize it till you turn it off. Like I usually have my mixes set up where I can, you know, at the push of a button, you know, just kill all reverbs that are in place on a given mix, and it's kind of startling. You kind of go, "Wow, holy cow!" Didn't realize what things had those reverbs on them. You know, good examples of that were like on Tom Petty. You know, I really loved using really short chambers on the piano. That seemed to work really good. It gave this kind of just glistening brightness and punch to the piano that it did not have previously. You know, you can make it sound really, really good. I had kind of a secret weapon there on that piano. It worked so good, I couldn't believe it, you know. I'll leave you with this thought too. You know, another way to kind of shape things into your reverb, and I've demonstrated this before. It's an old trick. It's been around forever. Certainly, it's probably been attributed to Abbey Road as much as anybody. They were the first guys, or I don't know if they were the first guys or not. I can't say that for sure. But they're the ones credited with this idea of the Abbey Road filter as a pre-EQ into your plate. All right. And you can use this, obviously, in our world, into any reverb. I probably use it into plates and chambers more than anything. I don't necessarily do it in halls, because if I'm using halls on strings, et cetera, I kind of want that low frequency content in there. But in terms of shaping a reverb to get it to fit into your mix, this is a really, really solid trick. And it has to do with shaping the tone of what you're sending to the reverb. You know, I think there's and we're all guilty of this because it was a function of the technology we were using at the time. When we were on analog consoles, we didn't have a lot of high pass and low pass filter at our discretion, nor did we have equalization on auxiliaries at our disposal. So we kind of caught ourselves always EQing the return, or maybe doing some equalization inside the device, right? But it is not the same effect as equalizing what you're sending to the reverb. A great example of this would be a vocal, right? If you're compressing a vocal pretty heavy and it ends up being a very S-y vocal. Well, you know, if you're trying to put a big open plate on that, it's going to be Sizzle City, right? I mean, there's going to be S's flying everywhere. So instead of completely de-essing the vocal to get the reverb to sound better, de-ess the aux bus that is going to the reverb to get the S's to quiet down in the reverb. That's certainly one way to do it, for sure. But kind of taking that approach, actually I got one up here. Let me show you here. So you could take and put a filter on the reverb that is or on the aux that is feeding the reverb, right? So this is on my little chirp and burp here, so you can get a sense of how much you can impact the sound going in. And I'm telling you, like for getting vocal reverbs to sit, especially in live sound, this is a trade secret. I may have to charge you for this one, I'm sorry, but this is it. Okay, so that's the Abbey Road filter set. It's actually a little low. It actually goes a little higher than that. It goes up to about 350 or so. And this goes down to about 5K. All right, so that would be going into your reverb. So I'm just going to bypass it for now, and we'll get something you can hear. Let's go, well, let's do this. Now let's go back here. So, like I said, I wouldn't normally do this on a hall, but this will give you some indication of what you could end up doing. So we're just going to put this filter set in, going into this reverb, okay? Now, I know what you're saying. I know what you're thinking anyway. Well, why would you want to make it sound like that? In the mix, that just brings all of this kind of mid-range gloss right up on a vocal. It's just beautiful. You'll be startled how good that can work. And the best part about it is none of your S's will get in the way. This little mid-range filter here, you can just kind of adjust to get the vocal to sit against it. And it works just absolutely fantastic. Especially good on plate. Let me go back to plate here for a second. And that's on a relatively short plate. Let's see. Oops. So you can hear how much, certainly in front of in the top end, how much of that top end would get in the way on a vocal, right? Even if you did this. I mean, I could actually kind of see that on a vocal maybe. But I would definitely do that. And of course, you know, the Abbey Road guys, these were all passive filters that were on the input to their plate, right? So these were kind of fixed frequency sets that were done there. They didn't have the ability to adjust it. You do. And so, you know, throughout the course of a show, you know, if I had some wide open vocal that was very spacious in terms of music surrounding it, slow tempo, would I open up those frequency sets? Sure, maybe. Yeah, just set it as program change and off we go, right? So you have tons and tons of flexibility at your disposal to do those kind of things today, right? But that is certainly a secret to get a reverb to work in live sound, where you can get some glossiness and some easiness on that vocal without having it swimming and getting out of control, right?
Hey, Robert, would you ever use, for instance, like a parallel split of a channel that's not bus, that's only feeding that drive, so that you wouldn't have to, you know, to have it controlled that way? Would that be something you would ever do?
Are you talking about like not putting any reverb on the dry vocal or on the vocal, but just having it on a delay return or something? Try to
well, in
explain.
other words, like splitting the vocal mic so that the, in other words, if you had multiple things going into the reverb, but you only wanted to shape the tail of, let's say, the vocal mic, might you drive the vocal mic on a parallel just to drive it?
Sure.
EQ'd that way.
Sure,
I don't
great
know if
idea.
that's something you ever have done.
I think I would especially, I can think of times that I would absolutely do that if I was in a situation where I didn't have very much reverb. I had to use multiple reverbs on, like say I had to use, I had one reverb at my disposal and I had to use it on the drum kit, the piano, and the vocal, then
Right.
absolutely I would do that. Positively, absolutely. That way you can create different instrument and voice shapes going into the same reverb. So yes, positively 100%.
That's interesting. You know, I mostly do corporate, so I don't get to do a lot of this stuff. But I'll tell you what, it makes me want to go back and mix some music real bad.
Well, I'll tell you something, and this is going to sound crazy, but I've done enough corporate work to say I would do this. That there's an element, especially with guys with headset mics on, that are very close mic'd on that voice. If they're on a handheld, kind of the same way, especially if they're uptight on it, would I put some small room or some small plate on that and send it to the PA? You bet your life I would. You bet your life I would. Because it's going to make it feel better and sound better. It's not going to sound like DI voice, you know? I mean, I think we get scared off of it by sometimes just by thinking, well, I need to go get that voice forward and, you know, get it. Or I don't want to have anything. And of course, I wouldn't put any kind of big swimmy reverb on it. I mean, that's going to sound completely out of context and out of place. But would I put some reverb on that to make it sound natural? You bet I would. You bet I would. And, you know, this, now that we've gone through all this listening in stereo, right? I'll open up this can of worms. What does this mean for object-oriented mixing now? If you're in object-based mixing, I mean, there is no sense of stereo in that world. There's no correlation of stereo in that world. How are you going to treat reverb there? Think about that between now and the next time we meet, right? And I'll tell you something. I'll only speak from my experience. I don't know how I was going to handle, or I didn't know how I was going to handle it when I went into my first immersive mixing thing. I just thought, wow, okay. And I kind of caught myself trying to make stereo work in that situation. And the more you do it, the more you realize, wow, that's not really the game here, you know? And what you, at least this was my experience. What I started finding myself doing is taking each individual object and kind of giving it its character, whether it's, I call it kind of a wide mono aspect of it, you know, where you have the width control on on a mono reverb return. What I caught myself doing way more often than not was using mono reverbs stretched a little bit and just blending it in with the sound and using that as the object no matter where I put it. So everything kind of had its own little bit of space in the object space. You know, that seemed to work pretty well for music. If I was doing orchestra, would I do that? No, I would just use the orchestra or the reverb algorithm in the DSP there, because that's what it's meant to do, right? I would be creating a space around that orchestra, a common space around that orchestra there. So that making sense to you guys? That's what I mean. It's such a nuanced argument of when to use reverb. Boy. Oh. Any other thoughts, questions? Anybody want to chime in and add? Now, you guys are supposed to be contributing here. This is not supposed to just be me talking head up here. You guys are supposed to be bringing your game. I'm just going to clear out some annotation.
Robert, what do you think about like putting that filter on the signal driving the reverb? I've also heard and been in discussions where people use compression as well on the signal driving the reverb.
Well, I'll give you a couple examples of that. So I think one of the secrets of doing parallel compression really properly on drums, and this goes all the way back to the original concept of New York compression when they were doing it at Power Station, is that you've got to get those compressed drums into your drum room and your drum plate. That is part of the magic of that sound, is getting the non-compressed and the spanked drums added together and in that room and plate. Then all of a sudden it just jumps to life. You know, it's like, okay. Now I've heard this sound before, you know, I've heard this on record. So that's one instance where you're adding compressed and non-compressed into the reverb. But the place where I would be careful with that is with vocals, right? Because, you know, compression will have a tendency to enhance S's on a voice, etc. You know, where we might get it more forward, but we're going to probably have to deal with the S component of that. Do we want to take that S component and then send it to a reverb and create even more prominent S? That's certainly a problem area, right? Kind of do the same thing on guitars. Like, you know, if I'm using reverb on rhythm guitars, usually it's really tight. And depending on the style of music, of course, it's really tight. But when I get to a solo setting, well, I might have dynamic EQ on that to try to deal with that guitar tone. And it's usually relatively wet, you know, to get it up there. There's two different reverb components on the same guitar player, depending on whether he's playing rhythm or solo. Martin Fry, you got your hand up. Go, man.
Yeah, with regard to reverb on both non-compressed and parallel compressed drums, just a little clarification there. Do you mean specifically sending both sources, but the uncompressed in combination with the parallel compressed group to the same reverb in order to achieve that sound?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's
Okay.
exactly what I mean. Yep.
Yep. So you would send from your parallel bus to that same reverb bus directly.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, you know, the mechanics of it are, if you're doing your parallel compression in groups, right, where you have one subgroup that is not compressed, one subgroup that is compressed, you kind of have to be careful there, but you need to get both of those groups to the reverb, right? So in that situation, unless you've got bus-to-bus capabilities, you're going to have to take those two groups and send them to a matrix, and then that matrix is going to need to drive the reverb, right? You're going to add those two groups together and send them. Now, where you got to be careful is making sure that these two groups are in time with each other at the matrix. If they're not, they're going to comb filter, and that reverb is not going to sound right, right? I'm going to totally cop to something. That's exactly how I used to do my drums in the early days of D-Show. And for the longest time, I kept thinking, man, I'm guilty of it. I said, I don't think the plug-in reverbs sound very good. It's like, wow, that just is not the same sparkle that I usually get, etc. Only to find out after about, I don't know, maybe 2 years of doing this, that the subgroup and my aux send that was coming up with the non-compressed drums were out of time, and they were comb filtering going into the reverb. As soon as I got those two buses back in alignment, here came all my reverb. It was like, the time domain strikes again, right? So, I mean, it was a great lesson learned. But, you know, that, I mean, it was a perfect example of thinking that the reverb sounded crappy when actually what was happening was the signal I was sending to the reverb was really crappy. And there you go. But, you know, same sort of thing, you know, kind of getting off reverb here for a second, of that uncompressed and compressed drums. Part of the secret of low end there is sending both of those things to the subs as well. You can send the non-compressed and the compressed to your subwoofers. Game on, man. That sounds so much better in your subwoofers than just the non-compressed. And you can do some really fun things there. You know, we might get into this discussion in one of the labs. We're actually considering doing some of this kind of thing where you have the ability to blend your gate wet dry. So you could take, and this works. I'm gonna credit who I stole this from. I stole this from Big Mick, where you take the send that is going to your subs and you gate it down pretty hard, where it's very percussive and very choppy. There's not a lot of round leftover bottom end from the bass drum in it. It's pretty percussive, and send that to your subs, and you get this really tight kind of compact sub energy, you know. So it's messing with that envelope that you're sending to the subs. But that said, same sort of deal, right? If I take non-compressed and compressed drums, heavily compressed drums, and send them both to the subs, ooh, that's money. That's game on, man.
Check will be in the mail, sir.
Yeah, that one works really good. All right, well, you know, this was supposed to be a short lab, but here we all sit an hour and 17 minutes later. So, oh, wait a minute, we got a really long chat here, so I'm gonna read this. Maybe we'll finish with this. I think I was a little shocked the first time I patched in an actual EMT plate, you and me both, because it was an actual metal plate. Same with an analog spring reverb. I think reverb for object-oriented mixing would be part of situating objects in the mix in alternative spaces. It would also change the depth of field for the object, and this could be really interesting in combining spot and mic pairs. Christina, those are absolutely excellent points there, and I totally agree with you on all of those things. That was certainly my epiphany in my first object-oriented mixing experience, was, you know, creating individual spaces for each of those objects, individual depths of field, so to speak, for any one of those objects. And the beautiful part is you can have it where the object and its reverb move and position wherever you want. It's not like the object moves, but there's a reverb sitting around it no matter where it goes, right? You just create those two things together and place those objects, man, and it works really, really good. Honestly, I was a little surprised and shocked how good that worked. All right, if there are no other discussion points or questions, we will knock it on the head here, fellas. So the next one I'm going to do, and I'm going to make a plea here for more topics. If you've got more topics, please send them in the subject line in an email to me, and I'll start to develop labs for it. So if you've got other topics you want covered, by all means do so. The next one I think I'm going to do, I haven't fully vetted this yet because it might end up being a lot of work, but I think we're going to do one on harmonic processors, because those are kind of mysterious to people, and we'll do a very similar thing to what we did today, where we're going to look at a whole bunch of different type of harmonic addition, whether we're doing tape compression or, you know, distortions or whatever. Let's take a look at all of those different types and examine what they actually do to inputs and what they're there for. All right, because that, you know, for the live guys, that's kind of a new world to them. You know, most guys pre-digital, you know, a lot of live guys had never experienced tape compression, had never experienced, you know, distortion compression, because this plays into kind of a gain structure argument on digital as well. Because, you know, without these processors, the only place we can get distortion or harmonic enhancement is overdriving our preamp. And that's actually very difficult to do on a digital console, to get it to kind of that sweet spot where, you know, where you can overdrive it a little bit and get some goodness out of it. That's very difficult to do on a digital console, especially for percussive instruments. So maybe that'll be part of the lab. I'll kind of prove to you how hard that is to do on a preamp, and then we'll talk about different ways to do that downstream to add all this kind of gooiness and goodness to your signal. And I'll pull up a bunch of different harmonic processors, and we'll examine them all just like we did today. That sound any good? That sound appetizing to anybody? Right on. Martin Fry says yes, so that's what we're going to do. All right, there it is. production decision has been made. All right, so I'm pulling the ripcord. We'll see you guys in 3 weeks. Have fun. Be reverberant. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Robert.